Anybody know what we're here for?
Cookies?
Oh, John. We're here to talk about Exodus, but before we do that, let's back up and take a run at it, because some interloper came in here last week and stood here, and doggone guy was darn interested. That's frustrating.
Well, it was a nice change.
Yeah. John.
Other people coming too, mother's coming, so.
Anybody remember the book of Genesis?
What's that?
Do you remember the book of Genesis? What was it about?
The beginning.
All right. The word Genesis means origins, beginnings. It's about the origins of the people of God, about the forefathers that built the foundation for the people of God. And I think at its very core, it's about God's desire to have a people of His own. If someone would, if you could turn to Genesis chapter 12, in form of review, I would like us to look at Genesis 12, 1 through 4. Genesis 12, 1 through 4, please. When you find it, read it.
Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him. And Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when they departed from Haran.
Almost as old as John. Can you imagine?
I am almost as old as he was.
Okay.
Get your facts straight there.
Turn to Genesis chapter 15. Now, what he just read you in chapter 12, while you're looking for chapter 15, that is God's promise. Okay, God said to Abram, "Go to the land that I will show you, and I'll make you a great nation." That's a promise. We get to chapter 15. And Abram's a little concerned. Wow, this microphone is doing weird things. Jumping in and out. Abram's a little concerned because he doesn't see, although he did what he was asked to do, he hasn't seen the results. Not like you and me, we always wait patiently for the results when God promises those things, right? Well, Abram was not as patient as you and I, and he couldn't figure out why things weren't happening. And so he's real concerned and talks to God about it, and he says, "I don't have any kids. How are you going to make me into a nation if I have no offspring?" And God reminds him that he is the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. Abram doesn't give up easily. He says, "How do I know I'm going to possess? I will possess it if I don't have any children." And God does a very unusual thing. He tells Abram, "Bring me a heifer, 3 years old, a female goat, 3 years old, a ram, 3 years old, a turtle dove, a young pigeon." Brought all of those things to God, cut them in half, and laid them each half over against the other. He did not cut the birds in half. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. And God tells Abram, this is how you're going to know that I'm going to do what I said I'm going to do. I make you a covenant, a blood covenant. And in this amazing chapter, we see God moving between the halves and sealing ceremonially his blood covenant with Abram. So Genesis is about the origins of these people, about God's promise to these people, about God's covenant with these people. And then the last half of the book is about how all of that starts to unfold and about the children of Israel. And when we get to the end of Genesis, we're ready to start Exodus, we find out that those children are now in a bad place. They have fallen into slavery, and things have gotten very difficult for them. So turn to Exodus. We're going to pick this story up. Now, I was tempted to just bring a big movie screen in and show you this, because probably no other part of the Bible has been more memorialized in movie history than the book of Exodus. Do you remember, what's the first movie you remember about the book of Exodus? The Ten Commandments. Got any idea when that was made?
55.
Real close, but no. Believe it or not, and you probably don't know this, the first movie, The Ten Commandments,
35.
directed by Cecil B. DeMille, 1923. It was a silent movie. I've never seen that. I would love to dig that up and see what it's about. But in 1956, Cecil B. DeMille produced and directed a new version of the Ten Commandments, starring Moses himself. Now, I say that flippantly, but you know there's a lot of people out there in our culture who, when they think of Moses, they see Charlton Heston. The movie was, it was culturally a phenomenon, and it had a huge impact. And it won the Academy Award for Best Special Effects. I guess, all that water collapsing onto the armies of Pharaoh really impressed people. So those are two movies. And then later on, a third movie came along, which quite frankly is much, much more accurate. This could get bad in a hurry. If you want a summary of the book of Exodus, where the people who made the movie were very careful about being accurate, about trying not to go outside the lines of the book of Exodus, I suggest that you watch the 1998 film, Prince of Egypt. It's an animated film, so you probably would never think about watching it. But this American animated musical, it's a musical, was produced by DreamWorks Animation, and it's adapted from the book of Exodus.
Sorry. You need a Tums or something?
I've never spoken in tongues before.
T-U-M.
You think that's my stomach? The Prince of Egypt, both Christian scholars and academics and Jewish scholars and academics came together and advised DreamWorks about how to put out something that they could agree upon as something the Bible would support. Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was the principal partner of DreamWorks at the time, said that their main goal in making that film was to be faithful to the biblical text. And anytime somebody from Hollywood says they're trying to be faithful to the biblical text, I think we should reward them by watching what they do. So I really do highly recommend the movie.
Is that the animated Prince of Egypt?
That's the animated Prince of Egypt. There's a few things that if you're really picky, you can find that I would argue about. But in general, that movie tells this whole story of this. It's not just about the giving of the Ten Commandments. It's not just about the flight out. It covers the entire book of Exodus. And well worth 90 minutes of your time if you get a chance. So we're going to talk about Exodus. It is the story of God rescuing his people, the children of Israel, out of a difficult situation, out of the bondage of slavery. Now, but it's not just a rescue mission. It's the story of the developing relationship between God and his people. In the past, God was someone or something that was at some kind of a vast distance. But as we work through Exodus, he becomes closer and closer. This is the second book, of course, of the Bible, of the second book of the Pentateuch. Anybody know what that means, Pentateuch? The 5 books. These are the first 5 books of Moses. And it's commonly agreed upon by both Christian and Jewish scholars that Moses is partly the author, partly the collector of these texts. In the book of Exodus, you'll find, as you think back through those movies, you'll find the depiction of the 10 plagues, the first Passover, the parting of the Red Sea, and the giving of the 10 Commandments. Just monumental events in the history of the children of Israel. And of course, the book gets its name from that mass migration of the nation of Israel from Egypt. None of the movies, I think none of the movies, even the best of them, none of them convey the size of that migration. It's difficult to tell exactly how big it was because apparently they only kept track of the men. But if you counted everybody, and I'm talking about human beings, not animals, this group of people was probably 1 million strong, moving out of Egypt across either the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, depending on how you study that, but across a body of water and into another land where God would guide them. But that immigration out of Egypt is only the first part of the book, first part of the story. It's important to look at God in this story as a saving force, but he's also a force that provides expectations for these people. And those expectations for the children of Israel we know as the Ten Commandments. Now, to oversimplify dramatically, the rest of the Old Testament, is about how Israel meets or doesn't meet God's expectations and the consequences for what happens when you don't meet God's expectations. There's more of you here than I have copies of this. I don't know how, I ran out of ink this morning halfway through this program. So I only have about 15 of these. But if you could share them around. I discovered a place. You always have to be careful when you take information from the internet. No. Yes, really. Because you're going to find this hard to believe, but not everything on the internet is true. I can tell. I can see that. But there is a site called overviewbible.com. And I thought, wow, this is somebody who's talking about doing the same thing I'm trying to do. Let's see what this is about. And there's this young man named Jeffrey Krantz who has, so far, I found it to be a really good place to go to get an overview. It's kind of like the Cliff Notes of each of the books. And he does these things that he calls whiteboards. So on the right-hand side of this paper that they're passing around, you'll see his whiteboard of the book of Exodus. On the left-hand side, you'll see what he calls the themes for the book of Exodus. Those themes are God's faithfulness, Israel's theological origins. Genesis is kind of like the physical origins, where the events and how all this happened. But when you get into Exodus, it becomes a lot more theological. And Exodus is also about God protecting his name and his reputation. It starts to be a matter of what are these peoples around us going to think? They don't know about this God we know about. And we want them to be aware. And then once the Ten Commandments are given, you have the law and trying to live up to God's law. God's law, which was already broken before they came down off the mountain and delivered them to him. Mel Brooks has this wonderful scene. I can't remember which movie that's from, Aaron.
History of the World Part 1.
History of the World Part 1, where Moses comes down off the mountain and he says, in a very strong Jewish accent, I've got these 15 commandments. And boom, he drops one of them on the ground and it smashes and he goes, 10! I've got 10 commandments! Well, it didn't matter whether there were 15 or 10. The children of Israel couldn't obey them. So there's a real tension that begins to develop in the book of Exodus. And it's about the relationship between God and the children of Israel, his people that he's desired so much to have that he's gone to the effort of saving them out of Egypt. And then the fly in the ointment is their inability to obey him and their desire to listen to what other nations have to say or to offer them. And it exposes a basic fundamental flaw in human nature that happens over and over and over again. Whenever I study the Old Testament, I always, especially Exodus, I think, man, I mean, it says over and over again they were a stiff-necked people. But you have, the Monday morning quarterback gets to say, they were so stupid. How could they be so stubborn? And yet, they lived out exactly the flaws that we all have. So on the right-hand side, you see a breakdown of how the book is organized. First is the prologue. We remember when we last left the children of Israel, they were flourishing in Egypt. They had the Pharaoh's favor, and as a people, they grew like weeds. And pretty soon, the people who owned the land didn't particularly like the weeds that were growing up in their land. And Pharaoh starts to become concerned. And then the character of Moses is introduced. And as he becomes a young man, he has a strong salvific streak in him. Clearly, Moses is a foreshadowing of Jesus. There's no way around it. It's really obvious. Moses, unlike Jesus, is not God. Moses attempts to save the children of Israel by himself. Does anybody remember how Moses tried to save the Jews? What was his first attempt?
He killed an Egyptian.
He killed an Egyptian who was abusing one of his slaves. Didn't work out too well for Moses. He had to flee. And Moses fled from his own initiative directly into the hands of God. Many of us have had to flee from the mistakes we made in our own initiative and can only find a productive way to live when we allow ourselves to be in the hands of God, right? That's exactly what happens to Moses. And you have the first of many astounding confrontations between Moses and God at the burning bush. Anybody tell me what that story is? What happened? Why do we call it the burning bush? Was it on fire?
It was on fire, but it didn't burn up.
Ah, there was a spiritual fire going on. Moses saw this bush. His only way of describing it to us was that it was like it was on fire. But it was from that spot that the voice of God spoke to him and directed him. And now, Moses has stopped trying to save Israel himself, and he has been challenged by God to do it in God's power. So Moses goes back. He goes back to Egypt, and with the help of Aaron, don't worry, although Aaron's a flawed character.
He's
But he
older
is-
than he looks.
He's talkative, though. That's okay. So he goes back and he goes to Pharaoh and he says, "Let my people go." That whole scenario, I think the Prince of Egypt does really, really well, because it talks about the personal relationships and the strains and the changing roles. Imagine going to then the most powerful person in the world and saying, "You need to do this. You will do this. And my God says you should do it." That had to take a lot of nerve. And when Pharaoh didn't want to do it, God told Moses to tell him, "I have ways of making you do this." And it began. And you have the 10 plagues. Lest you have any sympathy for Pharaoh, this is a guy who decided to get rid of his children of Israel problem by killing off all the male children. Generally in the Bible, well, where is the other place in the Bible where we hear about killing off the male children? Herod and Jesus. Anybody see a parallel here?
Paranoid leaders.
Yes, paranoid leaders. And I think if you're going to put on your resume that you are an arch villain, then probably killing off a generation of males would be a good thing to put on your resume. Because that these were bad guys. Pharaoh was a dangerous man. But by the time the end of the plagues came, he was a broken man. And so God leads the children of Israel out of Egypt, and you have that incredible scene where they're trapped. They're trapped up against this large body of water. And the chariots of Pharaoh have come, and they're pretty certain they're all going to die. But Moses is commanded by God to raise his staff and open his arms, and God parts the waters. And they cross into what is called the wilderness. And before their feet, they've been saved by God, and before their feet are dry, they're saying, what in the world are we doing here? We're going to starve to death over here. Yeah. And so we come to the story of God at Mount Sinai. And in that part of the story, I want you to notice that Moses is not just their savior and their leader, he becomes their intercessor. All of the characteristics that we look to Christ for, Moses is exhibiting these characteristics. Up on the mountain, God knows that the people in the valley are disobeying everything every command he's about to give them. They're screwing it up down there. And Moses prays, begs, beseeches God to give them another chance, not to throw them away and start over again. And God allows that to happen. So that's parts 1 and part 2, and now we come to part 3, and that is the relationship to God and Israel in the wilderness, in the Sinai. They now have God's basic laws before them. And there is nothing more fundamental than these laws. There's no details. They're just basic instructions. Moses is the one who's going to interpret the details for them. And as time goes on, he gives them more and more detail on how they are going to live in this relationship with this deity who has saved them. And it's important that at this point in the story, Israel agrees. And they say, yes, he will be our God, we will be their people, and we'll do what we're told. That's chapter 24, but it doesn't last much longer. Okay? And as time passes in this segment, God gets more and more detailed with them. They have seen him as a cloud of smoke and a cloud of fire, and that's mostly been at a distance. He's not just a nebulous, unknown God, but because they've experienced the pillar of smoke and the pillar of fire, and they've seen him in action, and so they're more aware of him. But in chapters 25 to 31, we see something new happening, and that is that God allows them to build a tabernacle. What's a tabernacle, by the way? It is, in this case, it's a tent. What it really is a portable temple. Okay? It's a temple that they can pick up and move with them. And he gives them very specific instructions through Moses on how this is to be done. And it becomes the place where they interact with God. And so he's gone from being insubstantial, something they never really meet, to being, they can actually place him. They know where he is. We have one step farther to go. And that is that we will meet him in our hearts. But for these people at this point, as a nation, they have developed a relationship with the deity and they know where to find him. He's at the tabernacle. Part 3, chapters 32 through 34. Israel does what comes naturally to them. They break God's law. The people have been worshiping this golden calf. They get a second chance. They build the tabernacle. And God indwells it. God fills it. God is there. But not even Moses can enter this place. Wow. I don't think these 8 pages of notes are going to make it. So, when you're looking at themes for this book of Exodus, it is that God has a salvific quality. God saves people. God redeems people. God lives up to covenant with his people. God's presence is known to his people. So by the end of the book, we have God dwelling in the middle of Israel's camp. Trying to look at what I can skip. There is a significant turning point about 2/3 of the way through this book. And that is that the stiff-necked people resist the instructions they've been given, to the point that God says, I don't think I can work with this group. I don't think I can work with these people. They're too disobedient. And so, what could have been a trip of a few weeks to this land that God has promised them, and God keeps his promises, God says, we're going to take a little detour. And it's going to take 40 years. It's going to take a full generation. And all of you are going to be gone. And your offspring are going to be the ones that get to the benefit of my promise. Because you just will not listen. Interestingly enough, even Moses sort of fell to the same pattern. Because at the end of Exodus, we know that Moses is not going to get to enter the promised land. He is. Well, you can tell me, what did Moses do that caused such a problem? Hey, that's what he did. time is the fire in which we burn. Moses disobeyed God, did what he thought was right. And God could have punished him severely, but what he simply chose to do was say, you're not going to go into the promised land.